Welcome. It's a delight to see you all here for our first Cary Lecture of this season, this year. And I want to thank you on behalf of the whole committee, some of whom are here and some of whom are not, given that it's Columbus Day weekend, so it's really a joy that you all came out on this horrible night. Now I'm going to tell you about the Cary Lectures. Before I do that, please look at where your exits are. The exits are behind you, that way, and to the side here. And in the event of an emergency, that's where you should leave. And does anyone want to know where the bathrooms are? I will tell you, they are downstairs, men's and women's, ample supply down the stairs behind you. We're able to offer a series of 4 free lectures each year, wholly supported by the Isaac Harris Cary Fund, I can never get that straight, which was set up by 2 sisters, Susanna Cary and Ellen Cary Farnham, in 1921, to help educate the townspeople of Lexington. At the time, it was a farming community. Now almost everybody in the audience could give a lecture themselves, so this job is getting harder and harder. They also gave our town this beautiful hall, Cary Hall. This is technically the Marjorie Batten Auditorium, named after a town meeting speaker for many years. And town meeting meets here as well. They belong to a different branch of the same Cary family that gave us our library, and we work together with them to bring you these lectures with the library. Now, please stay tuned for the lectures to come. On Saturday, November 18th, I'm trying to hold this up and also not be blinded, we'll welcome the dumpling chef and food activist Irene Lee. In the spring, on Saturday, March 9th, 2024, Jeff Leonard and friends will talk and make music. And finally, on Saturday, April 20th, 2024, the economist Raj Chetty will speak on the creation of equality of opportunity in the US. In a way, his talk bookends Professor Gittleman's talk tonight. They're both about educational opportunity in some ways. You can check details on our website, which is www.carylectureseries.org, and confusingly on the Cary Library website, which is carylibrary.org. And if you mix them up, you'll just get a lot of information. Tonight, we're delighted to introduce Saul Gittleman, our first speaker of the year, as I said.
A lot of A's.
Obviously, whose reputation precedes him. As I found when we publicized his talk, so many people were thrilled that he was coming. Saul, I don't have to tell you, is beloved at Tufts, where he taught a variety of subjects, and generations of students claimed he was the best professor they ever had. Because of his lively interest in and support of the sport, Tufts recently renamed its baseball field Saul Gittleman Park, just this past spring. He's Professor Emeritus. I was trying to figure out exactly of what, because he and I share a PhD in comparative literature, so I'll say that, right? Of Good. Comparative literature, though he's taught everything, and a former provost, and the author of 6 books, some of them on baseball. He's going to talk to us tonight about the subject of his most recent work, whose title is An Accidental Triumph: The Improbable History of American Higher Education. We'll be selling his book in the lobby after his talk, and he'll be available to sign copies. I've read it, and I can testify that it's a fascinating and surprising read. Professor Gittleman, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. So everybody can hear all right? Okay, just want to make sure. That's always a big deal at our age. We want to make sure we can hear and see. I want to thank the Cary Committee. They've been very, very gracious, very helpful. We just had a wonderful dinner together and great conversation. So thank you all for making life easier for Rob and me. And I'm delighted to be here. It's difficult to imagine a more appropriate venue for a discussion on American higher education than Lexington, Massachusetts. 67% of the adults have graduate degrees. I mean, it's really quite an astonishing town when you put it all together. You know, you had Professors Deaton and Case here a couple of years ago to talk about their very interesting book called Deaths of Despair. And he referenced for the first time, I remember saying, that there was a survey that he would plug into to get information about how towns, cities referred or dealt with higher education. There is such a survey. There's 60,000 American cities are surveyed annually about the impact of higher education on their community, which ones have the most added value for higher education, which ones have property values that go up because of the extraordinary level of higher education. Last year, Lexington, Massachusetts was 4th on the list in the nation. This year, they happen to be 6th. They fell all the way down to 6th, but they're doing very, very well. And it's astonishing that this is a community where higher education, which, by the way, the words don't appear in the founding documents. It's nowhere in the Constitution and nowhere in the Declaration of Independence. Nobody had to know what higher education was in the colonial times. But when they start polling, they do a lot of polling in these 60,000 cities to get information about how the community feels about higher education, how your values are shaped by higher education. They're going to have to ask a new question. In fact, they started asking that new question a couple of years. How many of you believe that higher education is leading to the decline in American life? Because that's the latest thing. If you look at a survey that appears in any one of the newspapers that you're still subscribing to, they are talking about how most Americans, and I'm talking about 60% of Americans, believe much of the cause of their misery, malaise, and the downward spiral of this country is blamed on the colleges and universities. That's the way they feel. They see us as massively failing. And if you read enough newspapers and watch enough television 3 times a day, you're going to get overloaded with this stuff because the stories about American colleges and universities inevitably are so totally negative. The leading one, of course, is student debt, which has now reached $1.7 trillion. Half of it is for for-profit institutions that jumped on the bandwagon. If there's a buck to be made in this country, somebody's going to make it. And Phoenix University, DeVry University, all those for-profit institutions are accountable for half of the student debt, but still it's $1.7 trillion. You see that in the paper. The endless hunt for prestige. What constitutes my kid is going to a school that is a higher ranked school than your kid is going to? The American incessant need for prestige. There have been articles about predatory faculty sexual abuse. I don't want to talk about it. I got a couple of former colleagues in the audience. That'll stay among ourselves. But I mean, the faculty is behaving terribly, and those stories are all over the paper. The incessant, obsessive hunt for donor dollars. They will take money from any school, and their constant report stories in the newspapers. I had one university president talking about donor dollars, saying the only trouble with tainted money is there taint enough of it. They want all they possibly could get. The nationwide collegiate basketball and football Division I race for the billions of dollars of television, gambling, betting, point spreads, corruption. They are filling the newspapers constantly. That's before we get to the poor teaching, the research fraud that you read about this last weekend in the New Yorker, the haunt for rankings, the rush for rankings, the need to find a high place in U.S. News World Report. The Wall Street Journal now does rankings. The New York Times does rankings. Everybody. The New York U.S. News and World Report, which was a third-rate journal 40 years ago, discovered the idea that ranking universities was going to keep them alive, and indeed it has. The other 2 magazines of the time, the Time magazine and Newsweek, are almost gone, and only the U.S. News and World Report is left alive. They rank everything. They rank cruises. They rank insurance policies. They're living on their ranking issues, and American people are hooked on rankings. This negative is not a recent hostility. That lovely ad that was put out by the Cary advertisers talked about the recent hostility of the American people toward higher education. It's not quite a recent hostility. The book that really started it all was written over 35 years ago. I'm sure you've got a tattered copy of Alan Bloom's The Closing of the American Mind somewhere on your bookshelf. How higher education has failed democracy and impoverished the souls of today's students. That was 1987. That was the first shot fired against American colleges and universities by one of its own kind, by a professor of classics, formerly at Cornell, now at the University of Chicago. And he started a search for a great golden age. There was a golden age of American higher education when everything was wonderful and American higher education delivered on the product that it intended to deliver on. I always ask myself, how would Professor Bloom have reacted earlier than the 1980s and the 1940s and 1930s, when the idea of a gay Jewish professor of philosophy, you couldn't have gotten a job if your life depended on it. But he looked about a nostalgic past, and that was something he wanted to find and something he wanted to insist on. And he shot that first shot of the mythical search for a paradise of higher education when we did it all right, because he said we're not doing it right now. That book sold over 1 million copies, and it was the beginning of an industry of books that were critical of American higher education. It's interesting because I don't believe any of it myself, but when he wrote that book in 1987, there were about 300,000 international students coming to the United States. In those intervening 35 years, we now have about 1,200,000 coming this year. That's after the pandemic had a major impact on the number of international students coming to this country. But they're back up to over 1.2 million, and if we let all the ones in who wanted to get in, we'd have 2 million, maybe 3 million international students who come to the United States. This is what they want. They're not only going to colleges on the American campus, they're going to schools that are not prestigious. They're not, you can't squeeze 1 million plus, 1,200,000 students onto the 30 campuses that take less than 20%. It's only 20. We've got 6,000 institutions that grant post-secondary degrees, and only 20 of them are really utterly difficult to get into, that take less than 20%. About 500 take anywhere between 20% and 50% of their applicants. The other 4,500 take everybody, or anybody they can get. My alma mater, I check on my alma mater, which you never heard of, but I check on my alma mater regularly every week. Currently, they're taking 89.9% of all their applicants. It didn't kill me. I met faculty members there who transformed my life. I never saw a category in all the rankings that said number of faculty that transform your life. But that's what the American college does. You may be a college that you never heard of, as you never heard of mine, but that's fine. I met 3 or 4 Methodist ministers at this faith-based institution, and they turned my life around and changed it permanently. That only happens in the United States. This is a story that I'm talking to you about that's more than just one city. I actually could have called it a tale of 2 cities. Lexington is the end of my time. My last book, I'm finished writing. I got out what I wanted to have said in this marvelous community, this marvelous town filled with extraordinarily educated people. But it reminded me where it all started. I started out in a town that couldn't be any as different as it got from Lexington, Massachusetts. I came from the grittiest of gritty cities, a seaport town filled with longshoremen. But it's important to know who I am and what opportunities America gave me. Was this the golden age? It might have been for me, I'm not sure yet, but for Alan Bloom, there was some time back in the past that was indeed a golden age. My parents were illiterate European immigrants who moved to Hoboken, New Jersey. My father had a candy store. We lived in one room behind that candy store. My parents came to this country in that slight window between the end of World War I and the passing of the Reed-Johnson Anti-Immigration Act that shut the doors completely and threw away the key. That was done in 1922. At that time, Hoboken, New Jersey was a seaport town, a closed town, but it was also a very representative town in many ways. Nobody talked about college because nobody went to college. And yet, it was a university town. We had no idea that the building whose windows we were breaking regularly belonged to Stevens Academy, Stevens Institute of Technology, a very good engineering school. But for us, it was just a building with lots of windows, and we had lots of rocks. We would go up there, break their windows, and run like hell. But it was a university town. None of us knew it. We had no idea that this was a town. And it was also a town, besides the fact that my parents were not educated people, they valued education. My grandmother would come twice a week by jitney and did something that was, for her, the most important thing in her life, and that was going to the movies. My grandmother was one of those 80 million Americans who went to the movie every week. She took me twice a week. Once a week, I went on my own. And I realized that it was in the motion picture that I got my civil education and got my American history. It was in Gone with the Wind that I learned about the Civil War. We never got to it in the classroom. It was in Custer's Last Stand that I learned about the terrible American Indians, all of whom looked like Anthony Quinn, and this whole life that was out there. That's where we learned our American history. She loved the movies. She was 40 years in this country and never, ever spoke one entire English sentence in her life. She never learned English, but she was a happy woman, and anytime she could see a movie with the Marx Brothers, she was happy. And that's where I had my introduction to college. We saw a movie called Horse Feathers, in which Groucho Marx played Quincy, the president of the institution, Quincy Adams Wagstaff, who was appointed president of the institution because the big game against Huxley College was coming up, and we needed to win the football game, beat Darwin College under any circumstances. Now, college teams in the 1930s, when I was going to elementary school, were allowed to hire 2 professional ball players. I bet you didn't know that. You were allowed to hire professional athletes, and President Wagstaff hired Harpo and Chico as his 2 ball players who appeared in the backfield of the team. Zeppo was otherwise occupied. Zeppo had a girlfriend who was called a campus widow, an older woman who hung around the men's dormitories and gave exceeding pleasure to all the men's students. College sounded wonderful. I could not wait. At the age of 7 or 8, we lived in Hoboken until I was 11 and a half. I couldn't wait to go to college. Then I saw Pat O'Brien and Ronald Reagan and Newt Rockne All-American, and all I wanted to do was go to Notre Dame. Notre Dame was, for me, the ultimate apex. My brother found out I wanted to go to Notre Dame. He started hitting me. But Notre Dame, I wanted to go to this great Catholic school that had this great Catholic football team. And then in between, every once in a while, we saw an Andy Hardy movie or a Judy Garland movie or a whatever movies that appeared with college scenes. Everybody was white. Everybody was happy. Everybody sang songs. And everybody on the faculty was male and white and probably Protestant, but that's who we were. And that seemed to me perfectly acceptable, perfectly fine. That anti-intellectual spirit stayed with our attitudes toward American colleges for many, many years, right up through and including what was the last great anti-intellectual statement made by Hollywood. Hollywood always seemed to get it right, that articulated what they thought Americans thought about colleges. 1978, John Belushi, Animal House. Another example of Hollywood finding the pulse of America when it comes to college. Or you might find a college-educated person in an occasional literary work. The first college person I encountered in American literature was Tom Buchanan, a character in F. Scott Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, graduate from Yale, class of 1915, a great football player, great scholar, great knowledge. He read one book called The Failure of the White Race in the World. He read a book that said, if there's more racial suicide, if more whites marry blacks, if more racial integration takes place, America will be destroyed. That was what he learned in college, and that's what he transmitted to all of his friends whenever he had the opportunity. It was an anti-intellectual perspective of American college because that's how we liked our heroes. Who are the great American heroes of invention and creativity? The Wright brothers, Thomas Edison, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Henry Ford. Only Charles Lindbergh actually crossed a line of a college campus. He lasted 3 semesters at the University of Wisconsin before he resigned. So what is America? My first exposure was this Marx Brothers thing with then Newt Rockne. What did Americans think about higher education? Very few people were going to college. When I was learning about college for the first time in the 1930s, my first exposure to college, I happened to go to college because my baseball coach, when we moved to another town, came to my home one day. My parents knew I would go to college, wanted me to go to college, but they had no knowledge of colleges. They didn't know any. They knew nothing about prestige. Prestige meant if you drove a Plymouth instead of a Buick, or you drove a Ford instead of an Oldsmobile. That was prestige. Nobody assigned prestige to any American college. And so there was something that they were totally out of knowledge of it. And I had my senior year, and I was going to go to college, but nobody knew where. It was at that moment that my baseball coach came home, sat down with my parents, and said, Saul will go to Drew University. It's only 20 miles away. They have a Methodist seminary there, a little liberal arts college, and they play baseball. And he can go there. He won't have to go far away. You can go there on weekends and deliver your salamis to him. And that's what happened. I went to this tiny little Methodist school where the faculty published nothing, and it transformed my life. I met faculty members who I had never ever dreamed existed. They took me under their wings. They created for me a whole world that I had never existed for me before. That happens only in America. Those things don't happen anywhere else in the world. So how do we look at, how do we try to figure out where we are today? How did we get here? It's a story that starts in a not particularly promising way. If I look at Hoboken, I say that wasn't the beginning. If I look later on, I look at the world that Alan Bloom had, that wasn't the beginning. To go to the beginning of American higher education, you have to go back to the 17th century, to the Puritan age and the founding of the first college, right here in our own backyard. Harvard in 1636, right? But there were other schools, small, tiny little, really biblical colleges, if you will. They were colleges of faith, and they hated each other. They were all Protestant, but they hated each other as a matter of life and death because they were hanging Quakers on the Boston Common. And I don't make this up. The statue of Mary Dyer is out there right now. If you ever want to go and visit where the Quaker ladies were hanged, they hanged 4 Quakers on the Boston Common. If you didn't find sufficient religious fervor on the campus at Harvard, you moved. There were many, many who were much more pious, wanted to find a new haven, and moved to a new college named Yale. Calvinist, very rigorous, very faith-based, very religious, and they, if they had the opportunity, would drown Baptists on the banks of the Charles River. So it was a matter of life and death, who you were, and they were all Protestants. It wasn't a question of Catholics or Muslims or Jews. No, these were all Protestants who had evolved and learned to hate each other, which is what they did. The evangelical Presbyterians believed that Christ was going to return to South Jersey, and they took off for New Jersey. And there they founded the College of New Jersey, which soon became Princeton University. So they all became colleges, and they were all evangelical, all faith-based, all taught Bible, Greek, and Latin, and they had one singular purpose: train ministers. That was the intention of all of them. The Episcopalians had William and Mary down in the Virginia colony. Another one was founded in New York City, King's College. It became Columbia, but they were very limited in their scope. Thomas Jefferson had another vision. He wanted to have one that was not quite as faith-based, even though it was going to be Christian. So he created a public university at Charlottesville in Virginia. It was still faith-based. We had compulsory chapel, but you could major in things other than Bible and learn something other than Greek or in Latin. Except the faculty slept with loaded pistols under their pillows because they thought they were going to be murdered every night by drunken students raging around the campus. So Jefferson was unhappy with ultimately what turned out. And they did produce ministers. In 1705, at the beginning of the 18th century, there were approximately 1,800 ministers in the colonies. By 1805, by the beginning of the next century, there were 40,000 ministers. Some were college educated, but these little colleges were only educating small numbers. Other people became ministers by self-baptizing, by self-programming, by learning the language themselves and declaring them ministers. We needed a lot of ministers in the early part of the 19th century because something happened in 1803 which changed everything in America. 1803. Thomas Jefferson takes on Bonaparte's offer to purchase a gigantic parcel of land that increased the size of the United States by 2.5 times. The Louisiana Purchase. and Jesus Christ crossed the Appalachians with a vengeance, because many of these 40,000 ministers went across determined that this was God's mission, this was God's purpose, because these people who were then picked by Jefferson to explore the territory just acquired were going to get themselves somewhere by hook or crook all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So Lewis and Clark started, and following behind them was an endless number of preachers and an endless number of citizens determined to bring God's will to the wilderness. Now, the Native Americans had not read the fine print of the Louisiana Purchase. They were living under the illusion that this was their land, this land that now is being occupied, besieged by thousands and thousands of new settlers who are coming in. And what did these new settlers do and these ministers do? They immediately established small church-affiliated Christian colleges, some of whom you probably still hear about. Schools like Beloit, Allegheny, Moravian, Wesleyan, Grinnell, Coe, Aquinas for the Catholics also had a few. Notre Dame was established. John Carroll was established. They were hundreds and hundreds of little church-affiliated colleges started in this territory in the first decades of the 19th century. As fast as they came, that's how fast hundreds of them disappeared. They disappeared. Why? Because of plague. Cholera ran rampant, could kill an entire student body. Competition with another denomination. The Wesleyans were everywhere. The Baptists founded colleges in every community they could. But the Episcopalians, the Protestants, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, there were colleges everywhere. Tiny little ones. Some survived, but hundreds of them literally disappeared. But thousands of them put down their roots and stayed there. They were faith-based institutions that became the basis of civilization in this new territory that had been occupied by the United States of America. Latin and Greek was not too much help on the frontier. They didn't need it, and the people who settled there said so. They said so much to their legislatures. What good does Latin and Greek do us? The Bible is fine, but it's not going to help me get my crops planted. And before the Civil War broke out in 1860, government officials were listening to the settlers and the small businessmen. And there were thousands and thousands now running all the way to St. Louis and beyond. Trappers trying to figure out how to start a small business, farmers trying to figure out how to grow a crop. They needed help. And they turned to their legislators and they said, help us. And finally, a senator from, of all places, Vermont, heard their appeal. His name was Justin Morrill, and he said, I tell you what I'm going to do. I will help each of these territories or states create a college or university that will be dedicated to helping the farmers and small manufacturers. Their subjects will be not Greek and Latin, but it'll be agriculture, mining, manufacture, or mechanicals. They will have those magical letters after their names. Texas, A and M. And they eventually merged into the state, became the state universities. Now, how are they funded? Justin Morrill said, we will give each state, it was going to be state funded, each state 30,000 acres of prime lumber and farmland to sell. Each representative will get a 30,000 acre allocation to this state. So if you have 3 representatives of 4, it would be 120,000 acres. They sell that land, harvest the farm, harvest the wood, and have enough money to start a university. This was the beginning of the great A&M movements. And it was based on what idea? Vocationalism. Forget the Bible. You can keep it. They were all faith-based. They all had compulsory chapel anyway. But they were not faith-based in the same respect. You could do Latin and Greek if you wanted to, but it was primarily vocational education. It said women could come, but they didn't make it easy for them. It said blacks could come, but they didn't make it reasonable or easy for them. In fact, this was going to be a white man's institution. If you ever listen to the Lincoln-Douglas debates of 1858, you have a hard time figuring out which one was going to be the one who did the Gettysburg Address. Both of them were apologetic, or not at all apologetic, about what represented this country. And Douglas said it, and Lincoln didn't deny it. This was a country built and created by God for white men. They made it clear. They wrote it down, and they made it abundantly transparent that that was the nature of this country. From the very beginning, if you were red, black, yellow, or brown, you were in trouble in this country. And the Louisiana Territory and the way education was built, even in the public level with the A&Ms, that was acted out by those people. And so, but there was one other component, because one of the great reasons one of these schools were under threat was assault from the indigenous population. Many of these little colleges were burned to the ground by rampaging Native Americans who said, we leave these things up here, we're going to be pushed out and pushed further and further west, because you can't trust these white men, you can't trust their treaties, you couldn't trust Jackson, you couldn't trust any of them. They broke their treaties, they lied, and we have to figure out a way. The only thing we can do is defend ourselves. So all of these schools that were now being formed, all of these state universities had built into them, all of these schools that were grants of land, had built into them the idea that the institution must teach defense against the enemy. And that became the basis in the land-grant colleges and universities of America of what? ROTC, which is mandatory in all land-grant institutions. It started with defending against the Native Americans, but now it's built in. We have a couple of anomalies, land-grant schools that you don't think of as land-grant schools. Cornell is a land-grant school. MIT is a land-grant school. They must have ROTC or they will lose all their grants. They're not going to do that. So MIT, no matter how the student body reacts to it, will continue to have defense built into their curriculum. The next great movement in America, but these were not schools that were going to challenge anybody. I mean, we had a great European tradition. Giordano Bruno, we had Luther, we had Melanchthon, we had the greatest minds in Europe teaching at the European universities. These were not the greatest minds in Europe. This was a guy who could teach a little bit of mining. Somebody else could teach a little bit at his agricultural station, get these people to learn how to grow better crops. But this was not what you call really high-level intellectual engagement. These schools were down and out, agriculture, mining, help Americans make a living, strictly vocational. But something else was happening from the Civil War on. The Civil War produced enormous fortunes. Americans made millions. Some Americans made billions. They made it in cotton, tobacco, and slavery, but the real big amounts of money that were gathered came from fuel, oil, railroads, canals, waterways, and the names associated with the gathering together of this huge wealth were names like Hopkins, Rockefeller, Stanford, Cornell, Duke, Vanderbilt, Carnegie, Mellon. Now, what do they all have in common? They all have they had money to burn, and they also all had institutions of higher learning named after them, because they saw something that they wanted. They saw it on the other side of the Atlantic, because something was happening in Germany in the 1860s that culminated in 1870. That's why all of you should, at one time or other, take at least 2 courses in American or European history, still. In 1870, 2 countries were united, from a lot of little countries, turned into 2 big countries. One of them was Italy. The other was Germany. A visionary prime minister created a Reich, the Second Reich, but he wanted something else. He didn't just want nobility. He was a nobleman himself. His name was Otto von Bismarck, and he had an idea. He had a vision. He said, I want to combine what we do best in this country. We work hard. We have creative businesses. We have brilliant scientists. We have the capacity to make great things happen in a unified university system, and that's what I want. I want a nation dedicated to research and research only. For that, we need a new degree. The Magister is nice, your master's degree, but we need a new degree that is not only dedicated to research. It has nothing to do with teaching. Only research. No young people, no undergraduates, only graduate students, graduate school only. And the new degree was called the PhD. And Hopkins and Rockefeller and Stanford and Cornell and Carnegie and Mellon and Vanderbilt looked over to Germany and said, we want that. We want our universities to work with our industry hand in hand for the benefit of the country, and as a byproduct, we'll make a lot more money. But that's the way they wanted it, and that's the kind of institutions that starting in 1869 with the first and probably the most interesting one that said in its preamble, we want nobody who can be designated as an undergraduate. We only want graduate research. And that was from a Baltimore businessman named Johns Hopkins, who was also interested desperately to improve the quality of American medicine, which was embarrassingly bad. Most American doctors worked out of barber shops. There were about 150 medical schools that were owned by the faculty. They were proprietorial. When they were surveyed, the person who was sent to look them over in 1910 said you should close 135 of them. They're no good. They know nothing about medicine, and the people teaching them know nothing about medicine. We need new degrees. We need new people, and Johns Hopkins wanted to advance the teaching of medicine in the United States. Above all, pharmaceuticals, business, science, working together in research. The Germans had a name, Hohe Wissenschaft, high science, high knowledge, great knowledge. And almost from the get-go in the 1870s, as soon as it started, the Germans owned it. Names like Koch, Ehrlich, Röntgen, finding the cure for diseases, syphilis, various other scourges, cholera, that were wiping out huge populations. These guys were discovering viruses, vaccines, and put German pharmaceutical business, science, together with the universities and also with the military, all together to solve disease and make the German universities the greatest in the world, and that's where they stayed. The Germans honored their scientists. They loved their scientists. They put them on the top of the pinnacle. The Germans honored also their historians, their theologians, who all worked for one purpose, the glory of the state and for Wissenschaft. So for those years in the 1880s, 70s, 80s, 90s, when the Nobel Prize was created in 1901, it was like a wholly owned German subsidiary. They owned it all. It was completely theirs. The United States wanted to compete. These guys wanted to compete. But there weren't enough academics in America to be able to teach science. They tried to import as many as they could from Germany. The rest of Americans were poorly educated. There weren't enough high school students. There weren't enough good students available to do research. So, and also the business model required undergraduate tuition dollars. So ultimately, Johns Hopkins, which for the first 15 years of its life refused to take any undergraduates, eventually had to capitulate and start taking undergraduates if they could find ones qualified enough to be part of this system. But the American Research University, privately owned, all of these were private schools, were founded by the 1870s, 1880s, and 1890s. In 1900, the American Research Universities banded together, and there were only 14 of them, to create what they considered a rival to the Germans. It was called the AAU, the Association of American Universities. There were only 14 altogether. Within the next 30 years, they added one more. But they were made up of Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Michigan, Stanford, Cornell, Hopkins, and a few others. Some of them wound up with too small to do it. Clark was one of the early founders of the American Research University. But they did create something unique. They did create this new PhD, and they created a new environment for America where research was probable. First and foremost, where you went wherever research took you. Now, The rest of America wasn't ready for this. The rest of American higher education was still mired in the American preoccupation with race. Once it became clear after 1876 that the South might have lost the war, but they won the peace. Reconstruction failed in 1876. The Northern armies left the South, and the South was left again to create any kind of racial apartheid that it wanted. By 1896, the Supreme Court, in a 7-1 vote, validated what principle? Separate but equal, Plessy versus Ferguson, and that ingrained it in stone. You don't look to the Supreme Court for relief on issues of race. We only had one anomaly, and that was the Warren Court for 13 years. The rest of the Supreme Court really reflected what American values were all about. And so we were preoccupied with race, and it became dominant for us and affected our higher education establishment. In 1892, at Harvard, the Anti-Immigration League was founded. The vice president of that league later became the president of Harvard. The chapter at MIT was founded, and the president of that chapter later became the president of MIT. Restrictive immigration, keep out these other people, became the way of America in the end of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. It lasted for 50 years almost. We don't want these people. We had discovered also a new way to study biology, and it was called eugenics. And it was the separation of one branch of the white race, if there was such a thing, called the Anglo-Saxons, that were not to be polluted by anything. Whether it was Teddy Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson, American presidents publicly said, we do not believe in racial suicide, and they advocated the non-mixing of the races. Wilson advocated it, Teddy Roosevelt advocated it. But we're not going to sandblast faces off Mount Rushmore. It's simply who we were. That were the American values all through the end of the 19th century and well into the 20th century. Restrictive immigration and eugenics were the two pillars of American educational thought, anthropologically and biologically, for the American university. So there was no way we were going to make any enormous, great progress in those fields when we constantly were studying race to prove that the white race and Native and Americans of a certain white Anglo-Saxon Tom Buchanan stock were the reason why America could be great. And that's where we were all through the 1900s, 1910s, 20s, 30s, and right into World War II. And got to the accident titles in the book. Why the two accidents? The gifts that keep giving. What happened? Everything that happened that changed American higher education happened between 1933 and 1944. In 1933, Germany elects who was their chancellor. Adolf Hitler comes to power. The legislation he passed in the first month was one that said for the purification of the civil service, and every non-Aryan academic was fired. That meant even if you thought you were a Lutheran, you were out of work. It didn't make any difference. You had to prove that you were 4 generations of pure Aryan stock. You had something called an hereditary passport, an Ahnenpass, and you had to prove it. And he purified the German universities. But before that, in 1924, Hitler had written letters of congratulation to American academics, saying, at least you got it right. And when Hitler came to power, he was handing out honorary degrees to a lot of American academics because he believed that America had found the right formula for keeping its racial purity alive and going. And from 33 to 44, Hitler destroyed the greatest university system in the world. In one generation, 10 short years, the Germans were destroyed and never recovered. By 1934, half of the physics departments were emptied. Now, we had a chance to get them, but our restrictive immigration laws were so powerful, they could not get jobs in American colleges. They got a couple jobs in black land-grant institutions in the South, and many of those German physicists who we would have had better luck with in American research universities wound up in little black colleges in the South. One or two of them got into the door. One of them was Albert Einstein. Another was a Hungarian named Szilard. And 6 or 7 of them got together and realized where German physics was going. It was going to build an atomic bomb. And they wrote a letter to FDR in August 1939, and they said to him, if we don't get the bomb first, the Germans are going to do it. Now, F. Franklin Delano Roosevelt knew there was no way that the Congress was going to pass any spending bills that were going to get money for a bunch of European immigrants with funny accents. And so he called in one of his Yankee friends, Vannevar Bush, and said, we're going to build a bomb before the Germans do. And Roosevelt spent $4 billion without one congressional appropriation. He built Los Alamos, Hanford, Washington, and Oak Ridge, Tennessee. We got the bomb. We got the German immigrants. We got the Hungarian immigrants. We opened up our immigration laws a little tiny bit to get them in and get them to Los Alamos. We won the war. And we changed American higher education forever. The Immigration Act changed gradually, melted away. The one other accident of enormous proportion, the one that changed the faculty, the white, all-male Protestant faculty, was a bill that was an accident completely, funded by all people and advocated by the American Legion, not your most liberal organization. And they said, in order to avoid a disruption of the returning veterans coming back from World War II, we should not do what we had in World War I, give a couple 100,000 a chance to go to college and let them go to college and avoid a recession. Well, instead of 200,000 showing up, 7 million Americans went to college. 2 million almost immediately. In a law passed, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, better known as unforeseen circumstances of legislation. We had no idea what we were doing, but we did it. And the GI Bill completely changed the faculty because suddenly you got millions of students on campus. You need hundreds of thousands of new faculty. And then one of our southern racist senators from Arkansas said, you know, we got all of this war material left in Europe. Why don't we sell it to the Europeans and let them pay us in their currency because they don't have enough dollars. We'll take it back in their zloty and lira and marks and whatever they want to pay us and let our kids go over for a year of graduate school in Germany where they teach research. And why don't we do that? And Senator William Fulbright gave us our first year of graduate study. There are now, I think, 84 Fulbright Nobel Prize winners in the United States. So the Fulbright Act, the GI Bill, a whole new generation of faculty, no longer white Protestant males, but people whose name ended with vowels and people whose name ended with Witzes and Bergs and Steins suddenly became the next generation of American faculty, and everything changed. The whole world changed. And once the faculty changed, there out went civility. You cannot have civility and diversity. They don't work together. You can have diversity and you're going to have conflict. And that's simply the nature of a dynamic society, and we were one of them. As I said, 1 million of them brought back war brides. Phil Fulbright gave them a year of graduate study. And it became, starting in the 1950s and 60s, culminating with Alan Bloom, who controls the American historical narrative. Somebody discovered that it wasn't Custer's last stand. It was bury me at Wounded Knee. Somebody discovered that Christopher Columbus wasn't the nicest guy in the world and was responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands, millions of Native Americans. We don't want to hear that narrative. And so the struggle for the American narrative began, and we are in the middle of it now, and it will not go away. What is certainly impeachable and cannot be argued with, we now own the Nobel Prizes. Lexington had its fingerprints all over this last one with a graduate of Lexington High School. We own that. We are, by all measurement, the greatest research establishment in the world. No matter how much we dump on ourselves, nobody can attain what American higher education has attained. As far as the little colleges are concerned, of which there are thousands, we are still a nation of faith. We have 1,000 Bible schools in this country, ranging in size from 500 to 100,000. They are tiny little places, and yet we are a nation of faith. We have Bible schools. We have small, large, for-profit, not-for-profit, urban, rural. You name it, we got it in this country. And they are the envy of the world, and our 1.2 million of foreign students, all they want is a place on one of our campuses. So it's impossible to replicate this. No nation, there is no Notre Dame in China. There is no Hillsdale College in Russia, or was in the Soviet Union. There's nothing like what we have. And no other country in the world wants to replicate it because they want to be in charge of it. They're all civil servants who work for the state in every other country. Our faculty don't work for anybody. They're anarchists. They're ungovernable. And that is what makes us the greatest nation in the world when it comes to higher education. Thank you very much. Now, whoo, all right, we have time for questions. We have time for questions. So I don't know how good I can see you, but if I get out of the way, maybe I can see you better. You want to just raise hands? Rita, is that how we should do it? How should we do it? Okay. Oh, here's the thing right here. Okay.
Is our method of financing higher education through student debt going to turn off the pipeline?
No, I tell you what, half of it is the for-profits. The Phoenix University and DeVry alone, I think, has close to $300 billion. So they're going to have to figure out where the for-profits that are out there really getting rich, even when they disappeared. So the student debt, 1.7 trillion is a huge amount of money. It's what it is for mortgages and cars. We love debt. This country is a nation that got hooked on debt, and we still get hooked on debt. We'll eventually figure out a way to get rid of it. There is still a tremendous pathway for free education. The community college systems are both in 47 out of the 50 states free. You go to a state university, you pay a couple hundred, you can get away with a very cheap, good education as long as you get off that terrible thing called prestige. Americans get sucked into it. We don't have to go into debt to get a great education. You go to one of these nameless schools. My little Methodist college doesn't make any list. It still doesn't make any list. So you've got so many great places to go to school in this country that you never heard of.
So the for-profit institutions,
they died. A bunch of them, and a few of them are still there. But and they're going to keep getting as much money as they can from the debting agencies. We are a funny kind of capitalism, very rapacious. I'm American patriot. I love this country, but we got a brand of rapacious capitalism that is wild and wacky, and we how to make money any way we can. This gambling thing with Division I athletics is crazy. We're spending $4 billion a year and giving kids credit cards so they can go and spend the family money in Las Vegas. And they go into a ballpark that used to say gambling prohibited. Now you can gamble anywhere. And then do you have a problem with gambling? They're gambling anonymous they're worrying about now. So it's a crazy country, and yet we do certain things that happen right. And higher education, as nutty as it is, we do right.
Yeah. Thank you.
How did the 4-year baccalaureate become the standard?
And
will it remain?
Yeah, it's an undergraduate thing. The two pieces don't go together. Research at a high advanced level and teaching adolescents who still see pediatricians does not go together. And the gift of teaching undergraduates successfully and advanced research are not the same thing. So we put these two things together because it's a business model. And it works. We started teaching young kids early. I mean, there were rules at Oxford and Cambridge about students shouldn't be rolling hula hoops in the 11th and 12th century. So the Europeans had very young kids also. We started taking them in from the select schools. Now Europeans are still doing that. Europeans, the rest of the world, still have the 11 and 12 plus. We don't do that. We let you go to any school you want, and then you go to apply to a college, and you start again all over for risk. We educate for risk. The 4 years are for adolescents to grow up. The job these kids are going to get at the end of 4 years won't even be invented yet in their senior year. But that's what we've done. And it gives kids a chance to grow up. It gives kids like me, that I was, and millions of American kids who met one transformative faculty member. One, changed your life. And we do that in this country with those thousands and thousands and thousands of little liberal arts colleges that are hanging on by their throat, but they've been hanging on forever, and they will continue. For every school that closes, another one opens. So, you know, it's not a system, it's an anarchy. It's crazy, but that's what we have created, and no nation in the world can afford to create it.
One thing you didn't mention.
I did mention a lot of things.
Yes. Okay, well, I'll only mention one that you didn't mention, which is that, I mean, I grew up in the UK in the 50s. I wasn't here, but, you know, the threat of communism was something that Americans were pretty concerned about then. And I think...
What was it of?
Communism.
Communism.
The Soviet Union.
Yes, yes.
And that led to government thinking Americans have to be top at science because we need, you know, the best bombs and all the rest of it. And that surely is the, you know, led to a lot of funding of universities. And that must be one of the reasons that American universities became really
Certainly, that
dominant,
was, again, out of the arm, out of the war.
part of your story.
It was out of the war that happened, and it happened because of this one Yankee, Vannevar Bush, who said, he created the NIH and the NSF. They were little agencies, but he made them gigantic. And even now, in President Trump's last year, he put through a cut in the NIH and NSF budget. The Congress increased it by $7 billion. I mean, they all are so focused on American research and staying ahead. And now these guys got the Nobel Prize, this couple from Penn, for creating the COVID vaccine. So we're looking the way the Germans looked in the 1870s for practicality. We're giving the Nobel Prize, or the Nobel's looking for practicality, for people that can help this country. As far as American communism, the first anti-sedition law was passed by John Adams in 1796. We've always looked for somebody who we can lock up and put in jail, and who we hate for whatever reasons. We can find reasons. We always had anti-sedition laws, anti-patriotic laws, and the presidents, I remember President Nicholas Murray Butler, who was president of Colombia for about 40 years, said, if you are against going into World War I and we're not in it, then that's freedom of speech. If you're against going into World War I and we've declared war, that's traitorism, and we're locking you up and throwing you off the university. And that's what they did. That anybody who was against World War I after we declared war was fired from Columbia. So that we've always we've never been a nation of complete justice, but we try. We try. You look to the Supreme Court for justice, you're crazy. You know, we had an anomaly for 13 years, the Warren Court. Earl Warren locked the Japanese Americans up and put them in detention camps. He looked like a safe bet. He turned into whatever he turned into. His first case was Topeka versus the Board of Education. His last case was Loving versus Virginia. In 13 years, he turned this country on its head, and the country wasn't ready for it. Not even from 53 to 67, we were not ready for it. And we may never be ready for it. This country is a country that is preoccupied with race.
Hi, I enjoyed your talk very much. I'm a former college professor.
I'll give you an A. Give everybody an A.
I followed your trajectory from the religious schools that taught classics to the grant universities that taught agriculture and mechanics. And I'm wondering, how would you describe what we have now, apart from chaotic?
80%.
And, wait a minute. And what, and I'm a professor too. What would you, if you had your druthers, have college be today?
Well, first, about 80% go to the big state universities. I mean, the schools that closed in Massachusetts, they're closed all over the country. You could fit everybody who was disrupted in the University of Michigan football stadium. You know, I mean, the little colleges that go have graduate 50s. So those little schools, that didn't make any difference about the number of them that come and go. They're small numbers. The big state universities, Arizona State is 80,000. I mean, Michigan is now 54,000. So the big numbers that where most of our American, and then state branches, UMass, Lowell, Dartmouth, the state, 70% of the 80% of the kids, even in Massachusetts, are educated at the state universities. So they are critical to who America is. Of the great, great, great state universities, they may not be land grants, but Berkeley, UCLA, University of Michigan, University of Vermont, Wisconsin, Washington. We have great, great, great research universities. What they have to do with football and I mean, what Duke is doing with Division I basketball, I have no idea. There is no Duke basketball program in it wasn't in the Soviet Union. There is no University of Alabama football in China. I mean, we do things that are so crazy, but we do it. And Division I athletics is one of the crazies.
What would you do?
I would, you know, the funny thing is it's nothing new. The only person who had tenure at the University of Chicago in 1890 was the football coach, Amos Alonzo Stagg. So the University of Chicago, great thing, football. They had a stadium with 25, 30,000 students already in 1890. So what would I do? You know, you go along with what Americans want to do. Americans want to gamble. They can't help it. They're going to gamble. My mother was a junkie. She'd gamble on anything. She had 16 bingo cards she couldn't count, but she knew bingo. So, you know, Mahjong games, that's spending $100 million. I mean, we got crazy. That's who we are. And who the species is, we will do all of that. What would we do to make American higher education perfect? If I could do one thing, if I could press one button, it would eliminate Division I athletics.
Thank you.
That I would do.
You've done a great job of taking us through the rollicking history of higher ed in this country, and you've talked a bit about how you would like it to be. What do you predict for the future? What trends do you see ahead?
I asked myself one question. Who is going to take over from us? When we fall off the top of the mountain, what nation has the capacity to do it? The Chinese have spent probably $100 billion in the last 10 years to build up their university systems. And as long as it's still going to be a repressive, they couldn't tolerate the freedom we give our faculty. They can't tolerate that. We're the only country in the world, no, the Brits do it, they have great physics, but there's nothing as ungoverned as we are. And now it's become part of the presidential campaign. DeSantis is running against higher education. So it's an agenda. We've reached that level. I don't know if we can inoculate ourselves against presidential campaigns, because the thing that changes, human nature doesn't change, technology does. So we got 24-hour news cycles now. You can't get event. And to try to find the truth, I don't know. Where the truth is, who owns the information, it's a very complicated world. Who's invading whom? Was it Hamas? Was it Israel? How do you find truth? I don't know. And you don't know. Okay.
Slight variation on the last two questions. As you pointed out, a lot of why we have such a good system right now is partially the result of lucky accidents. Can you think of anything that would increase our chances of having more lucky accidents to make the system better?
That's going to be very difficult because you got to elect intelligent people, and that is not happening. Mm-hmm. You got to have people. I mean, Fulbright was a racist because he had to be. He signed all the declarations of the South. No integration, no this, no that. He was also president of the University of Arkansas at the age of 30. He had a Rhodes Scholarship. He was a brilliant man, but he was trapped in the segregationist state. But if I could have a Fulbright back again, or give me any Democrat, Republican, I don't give a damn, just somebody with intelligence. And we have nobody running anymore who seems to be intelligent. Yet you look at DeSantis's credentials, it's all Harvard and Yale. I mean, they go to the best universities, and then they get votes by getting people who hate academics. Adlai Stevenson could have run 40 times for a president. He had a head that looked like an egg. They weren't going to elect an egghead. Americans would never elect Stevenson president. He ran in 52. He ran in 56. He couldn't win. He looked too smart.
So we need a brilliant person who doesn't.
You got to have somebody who can fake it.
Right.
I wanted to get back to Germany, but today, and I'm curious if you could describe briefly what the Max Planck Institutes do and whether
They're
you
very
think,
good.
and
The Germans.
if I may finish, and if you think that they're doing it successfully, and if so, why?
They had their fingerprints on the Nobel Prize. There was at least one Max Planck faculty member who was on the one of the 3 or 4 Science Nobel Prize. The German system is uniformly excellent. They just can't get to the next level to take America and push us off the mountain. But the 125 or so German universities are great research institutions. They're still great. They've recovered themselves. They're very good with women. They're very good with minorities. They're doing a very good job with their populations of minority. When we were over there in 1950, the Turks were getting killed. The Yugoslavians in Germany were being brutalized. Germans have come a long way. They've all created neo-right-wing Nazi European organizations in Hungary, in the Slavic countries, everywhere. That's not going to go away. That's who we are as a species. But the German higher education system is a very good one. Yes, they do make the decision at the age of 11 or 12. You're going to be a doctor. You're going to clean toilets. And once you get into that, you don't have the freedom that American kids have to make mistakes and change their mind. That's unique. Okay, we're done. Woo! No, I'm just...
I'm sorry if there were people who had questions still, but we really...
we'll stay around.
You want to, yes, well,
Yeah.
what we're going to do now is some of us are going to scurry to the lobby to put out the books,
Oh, you forgot.
the newest book that you've just heard about. And if you give us a minute to organize that, you can come and buy a book and have it signed by Professor Gittleman. And can I just ask for another round of applause for the wonderful talk?